you guys are doing, and I'm looking forward to seeing everybody else's, because I will have mine done and out of the way. Like Dr. Buck said, I've been in the college for a few years, more like 17. And 15 of those were actually spent in the pesticide applicator program, pesticide training. We have a few people from there here. And so that inspired me for what I'm working on. To give you kind of a background on what's happening once I get the clicker to work. It always works beforehand, but then once you get going. Yep. First of all, like Dr. Buck said, big thanks to the supporters for this research. Ohio Soybean Council was one of the funders, as well as the Ohio State Integrated Pest Management Program. I did focus groups, so a big thank you to the extension offices who helped me get the room, get things set up, and also helped me with the focus groups. And what we're talking about is soybeans, the #1 crop in Ohio, very important crop for Ohio. And to give you a background on what's happened, in 1996, there was some Roundup Ready soybeans that started to be sold on the market. So what that means is glyphosate is a herbicide that kills anything. If it's green, glyphosate will kill it. And soybeans have always been problematic. Herbicide management programs for soybeans are usually more expensive because most weeds we have are broadleafs. Soybeans are broadleafs, therefore it's harder to manage weeds in them. And so they came out with soybeans that you could plant in your field and they would be tolerant of glyphosate. A lot of you might know glyphosate is Roundup. You can buy it in any hardware store. So it changed the industry. Suddenly the farmers could apply a herbicide anytime during the growing year and it would kill their weeds. It really improves their yields, lowered costs. Glyphosate is much cheaper herbicide than the others, so it really changed the industry. The only problem is, if you use a single mode of action or the same herbicide time after time after time, you get resistance. It's kind of like you always hear in the wintertime that we have this antibiotic and it's not working anymore because we have superbugs that are resistant to it. It's because the same antibiotic has been used over and over. It hasn't been alternated with another family of antibiotics. Same thing with herbicides. So this is a picture from this summer in Clark County, and it's actually a field of soybeans. The soybeans are down here. All the tall stuff is mare's tail. They sprayed it, but the glyphosate did not kill the mare's tail. So for soybean farmers, this is going to reduce your yields. When you take your soybeans in, it's going to have wheat seed mixed in with the soybeans. You're going to get docked. You're not going to get full price. So to address this, the industry came out, and I apologize, I'm not sure how to get that off the top, but the industry said, okay, well, we have these soybeans that are tolerant to glyphosate, so let's add to that. And they have come out with soybeans that not only can you spray glyphosate on, but you can spray 2,4-D or dicamba on, which are two other chemistries of herbicides. It works. They kill weeds differently. So we're in a totally different family of herbicides. And these chemicals have been around for a long time. 2,4-D was came out in the 1940s. So people are very familiar with it, what it does. Dicamba has been around a while. Banville and Clarity are the two trade names that's available. Both of these are used heavily in corn production. Corn is a grass, it's not a broadleaf. These two herbicides kill broadleaves, so people can use it on corn. The only difference is these don't act like glyphosate. Glyphosate will drift, but usually glyphosate drift is local, where it's just an immediate area that the wind carries it over. It might kill some plants nearby. Dicamba and 2,4-D, they can volatilize. And so what that means is if the temperatures are high, those chemistries have a very low boiling point. So that means if the temperature is in the 80s or 90s, it easily turns into a gas. And gases can move more easily in air currents. The other thing that happens, you can have a temperature inversion. You know, like on a really foggy morning, you have cold air that's trapped underneath. And so you have this layer, you always get it as a fog. Well, in that sort of situation, if you were to spray one of these, it can volatilize and just move with that fog, and so you have a temperature inversions happening. Oops, it's just not acting very well. Well, so to give you kind of where we're at, I think maybe it's just the computer. There it goes. So we do have some crops that 2,4-D traditionally have always been, can do a lot of damage to. Grapes can suffer a lot of damage from 2,4-D or dicamba. Tomatoes and non-tolerant soybeans. Tomatoes and soybeans are somewhat related, and so anything that kills soybeans will kill tomatoes too, and vice versa. And so when these products came out, the seed was actually available in 2016. So that would have been past summer. The companies had the seed available, but they didn't have the correct new formulations of the herbicides available to use. So we had something where farmers put out the soybeans that were ready for dicamba, but they were spraying generic formulations of dicamba. This is a gentleman in Missouri, has 900 acres of peach trees. He is now in a lawsuit with Monsanto over the damage that he had on his peach trees from last summer. And then probably the worst thing that happened in Arkansas, so you have where you have someone who's planted beans that are tolerant of dicamba, and then farmers who haven't bought the new seed. And in Arkansas, somebody sprayed their soybeans that were tolerant to dicamba with dicamba. The next door neighbors were not. Killed the whole field. The farmers got together, things got out of hand, and one farmer actually shot the other farmer. So this is a very controversial area. Fast forward to this year, the new herbicide was available that was formulated to be used with new soybeans. However, there were so many drift complaints that the state of Arkansas has banned use of any dicamba in the state. Monsanto 2 days ago filed a federal lawsuit against the state of Arkansas because of that. Missouri, Illinois, as well as some other Midwesterns have really said there's certain times of year you just can't spray it. So there's a lot going on socially. And the main reason that I wanted to do this study is most of the research on drift has been on the physical phenomenon of drift. There's lots of work going in here at OSU and other places. Okay, farmer, here's different things you can put on your sprayer to reduce drift. There's the nozzles you can use. We've tested different weather conditions. It's all been about that, but the social aspect of farmers working with farmers, some farmers having damage, other farmers causing damage, hasn't been studied. So my hope with this was to have kind of a baseline of where we're at, what farmers are thinking, how farmers are approaching this when they have crop damage or when they cause crop damage. Some related studies in this area, really what we're looking at is what motivates people to act certain ways and why do they engage in certain behaviors and they don't engage in other behaviors. And so some of the studies have looked at why farmers will adopt conservation practices or why they won't adopt those. There's also been studies with equine or swine influenza. Some farmers vaccinate, some farmers don't. Why do some farmers vaccinate and some farmers don't? So we're kind of looking at what's their motivation. Do they want to protect themselves from this disease? Do they think that their livestock's not going to get this disease, so they don't want to bother with the influenza vaccination? So that's what we're kind of looking at. There's also been a lot of work on natural disasters and how people protect themselves. So if you live in a flood-prone area, do you do anything to help make sure that your house is going to be at low risk for flooding? Do you have sandbags? If you're in an area where there's a lot of wildfires, do you make sure that your house doesn't have underlying brush? How do you prepare in case a wildfire comes close to you? So this is kind of the motivation area that we're looking at in this study. And so the underlying theory, because of course I have to talk about theory, is protection motivation theory, actually developed back in the 70s. And this was developed in healthcare communication. And so what Rogers was looking at is, why do people smoke, and why do some people quit smoking but other people don't? And at that time, what we had found out was that fear appeals don't work. So when I think of a fear appeal, a good one that comes to my mind is in the 1980s, we had this just say no to drugs. And they would show a frying pan, they'd put an egg on and say, the frying pan's drugs and the egg is your brain on drugs. That's a fear appeal, to try to scare people into changing their behavior. But what they find is usually that doesn't work. People, for some reason, aren't influenced that way or motivated to change their behavior. And so in the theory, we kind of look at, first of all, how people perceive the risk. Do they really think it is risky? Maybe they don't think it's risky. Maybe it's not big enough of a risk. Or they think, oh, the probability of that happening to me is small. And then the second part is where we get into the protection motivation. And this is if people think they should engage in the behavior. So if I'm a smoker, and you can give me all the facts, all the figures, yes, I'm gonna get lung cancer and all that, but you know, I've been smoking for 15 years. Maybe I'm not motivated to quit because I think it's not gonna make a difference. I've already done the damage, so be it. I'm not gonna go through the time, the energy, the cravings. To me, that's too much of a cost for my lifestyle. And so in my book, because that isn't going to work, I'm not motivated to engage in those. So that's kind of what the theory is looking at. And so, of course, you have a model. And in protection motivation theory, we kind of look at those two areas. So we have, what are the rewards that I have offset by the risk, and how do those go? So if you think about it, we know that everybody that gets in a car to drive possibly could be in an accident. But why do we drive a car? Our rewards for driving a car is because we want to get somewhere. There's no other way to get there. The bus takes too long. I'm in a hurry. That's our reward for driving the car. And so we understand that there's risk to getting into that car, but we think the rewards of driving that car offset the risk that we could get into an accident. Well, how do we cope with the fact that, well, maybe we'll be in an accident? And that's where we get into our self-efficacy and our response efficacy. So my self-efficacy is I can take certain actions that I know that I'm capable of doing, and I can perform them. So I can buy a car that's higher rated in safety. I can put my seatbelt on. Those are all self-efficacy things that I can do that I think are going to take away some of this risk that I have from driving the car. And then response efficacy is my belief that those actions are going to have a positive they're going to have a positive outcome for me. So the fact that I do defensive driving, where I'm looking for rear people on the road and I keep my distance between the car in front of me, those are all the response efficacy that I know that if I engage that behavior, I'm less likely to get in an accident, and I'm reducing my perception of risk. So that's kind of the motivation that we're looking at and why people engage in things and why they don't. Conversely, if you consider, so, you know, I have a son who turns 18 on Sunday, so I understand this very well. The reward of driving fast in my car. What's the risk that I'm going to get in an accident? Well, probably at 18, and I'm a young man, I'm going to consider those risks as being very high. And, you know I can drive safely. Hey, I'm a good driver. I haven't gotten a speeding ticket. I haven't been pulled over by the police for a warning, and I haven't gotten in an accident. I'm feeling pretty good. So you can see where sometimes the threat appraisal, we might misjudge it to be lower than it is, and we might misjudge our coping to be higher than it is. And a lot of that is based on all the factors that go into this. So in my perception of risk, you know, there is the experts who will say what the actual fatalities is, but then all of these different types of perception of risk influence how I approach that. This has been done a lot in when they're studying nuclear power, and we're going to site a nuclear power plant. If you look at what the experts say, it's one of the safest forms of electricity. We don't have fatalities from nuclear power plants. But if you ask the average person if they're ready for a nuclear power plant to move in next to them, they're afraid. Because I've heard about Chernobyl, a past experience. Everything that happened there was awful when they had an accident. If there's an accident at a nuclear power plant, it's going to be really severe. So therefore, I'm afraid of it. So all these things go into our perception of risk that we have towards something. And then, again, the self-efficacy, my belief that I can do an action, and then my response efficacy that, yeah, I can do that action, but do I think it's going to do any good? Getting back that, yeah, I think I can quit smoking. I'm tough, but why do it? I'm not going to bother. It's not going to help me. So these were the theory that went into my objectives, and basically I wanted to find out what farmers' perceptions were in these different areas toward drift. What were some of the things that they considered as risky, maybe not as risky? Did they feel like they had self-efficacy? So it was mixed methods, yay! Did qualitative and quantitative. And so I did some focus groups in the beginning and then followed that up with a survey. And so I did focus groups with farmers, and I did it in 4 counties. I chose counties where I would have both grain farmers and specialty crop growers, because I'm looking at grain farmers who are more likely to be growing soybeans, using the new technology, and especially crop growers, they're going to have maybe some problems with it. So the top counties I used were ones that were in the top of vegetables or fruit, and then also in the top half of the state for producing grain. So this was from all U.S. Census data. And I got the farmers list from using private pesticide applicator lists. So we have about 14,000 farmers in the state of Ohio that have a license. License is required if you purchase restricted use pesticides. And those are available for all crops. And on their license, they have categories based on what crops they're raising. So I was able to glean from the information who are my grain farmers, who are my specialty crop growers, based on their categories. It also inadvertently includes some organic, because we actually have had organic pesticides they're used on organic farms that have been restricted use. So the list did include some organic farmers. So the focus groups are at the county extension office because it's a neutral place that they're used to coming for this sort of stuff. And of course I offered snacks. And the biggest draw, a $50 gift card. So these were recorded and transcribed. I used a script. We had the same script at every location for every group. I did separate the grain and specialty crop growers. I didn't want them together in a focus group, so I wouldn't have any things I didn't want in my research. And then with reliability, we used triangulation. I had the same moderator at every place, the same observer, so we can keep things as the same as possible for validity. With the surveys, so I chose 20 counties to send the surveys out to. Count your blessings. I had to do a mail survey because a big portion were Amish, and of course I didn't know who was Amish and who was not, and I did not have email addresses. So, so the population of applicators was 4,900 for those 20 counties, and so my survey population was, my random list was from 1170, and so I did get 438 return surveys for a 37% response rate. So, which is pretty good. So I sent out one survey, followed it up with a reminder postcard, and then a second survey. A big thanks to my children who are my data. There is an advantage to having older kids. And my one daughter is still recovering. This is a controversial issue, so I had notes all over the surveys when I got them back. There was notes in the columns, underlined words, explanation points. I had one woman that wrote me a letter that said, my husband got so upset he wouldn't finish the survey, but here's what he was upset about. And here's your survey, please send it to someone else. So it was fun, but so they were very passionate about this. This was hitting a nerve because of course we had all the media about what happened last spring and summer, and then the surveys came out, I had them out in June. So there was a lot of media attention, so that kind of spurred a lot of the response that I had. Okay, the demographics. I think this is funny, and anyone that works in agriculture notices this. My focus groups were 95% male and 5% female, and my goodness, my surveys were too. That came out, but as you can see, I separated my groups into the grain crops and the specialty crops, and I actually came up with a new group of farmers called mixed crops. This came out in the focus groups, and then I asked the same question in the surveys. In Ohio, there's a lot of farmers that have grain crops as well as specialty crops. And so when you start talking about drift, I found that their beliefs and a lot of their reactions were different actually than both specialty and grain. So they kind of came out as their own group within it. And as you can see that my percentages for the focus groups and the surveys were about the same. And then demographically, this here is acreage of their farms. And as you can see, most of my groups are about the same. Most of the farms being right here in the over 100 acres, but still below the 2,500. And also my ages being a little older, the 51 to 60, and then the over 60. And surprisingly, Pesticide Training has the fertilizer surveys they've been doing with people going through fertilizer training. These numbers are very similar as far as farm sizes and ages of farmers. So one of the things I ask the farmers is, where do you get your information? And so when I started the focus groups, they were in September of last year. So even though we had had a lot of the media attention about what was happening out in Arkansas and that, I still had 20% even on the survey that had not heard anything about the technology. So we still had a significant number of people that just weren't familiar with what was going on, but the majority of them had. And then I asked them, well, where'd you find out about it? And so this is a cheer for all ag communicators. Farm media still counts. 71% found their information either newspaper, magazine, radio, or TV is where they got their news about it. Conversations with other farmers, and then next was their co-op or seed dealer that they were getting information about this. So this would be usually people that are buying seed and their chemicals from. And then extension came in about 30% that they were getting the information from them. They could choose more than one. So some people chose more than one, some people just chose one or two. And so one of my objectives was to come out with communication strategies based on some of the findings that I have. And so this is important to know that the farm media is still an important source of information. The interesting thing was, though, for the industry, it was grain farmers that went to industry for their information. They were more likely to go to the co-op, they were more likely to go to their seed dealer, where the specialty crop farmers were more likely to go to extension, even though most of the grain farmers still did. And a lot of that in Ohio with our co-op system, the co-ops are set up, that's where most people buy their seed, and they serve who's in the county. Who's in the county? Grain farmers. They don't have services, products for the specialty crop growers, so that's why they didn't go to them. But because they have so many services and products for the grain farmers, a lot of them go to there. So this is just an overall look, and I'll explain each individual, but these were some of the findings that I have. And again, this is more of an exploratory study, and so I was just looking to see if we had any differences between some of these groups and how they assess the different. And so in the reward, and maybe I'll come back to this, I'll explain the individual areas, and then we'll come back to kind of what this looks like. No, you never know how to set these up. So the rewards of the new technology. This is the fact that they truly did have resistant weeds. In the focus groups, a lot of the, even the specialty crop growers are saying, hey, even we can't kill mare's tail. And so the fact that there were some resistant weeds was a reward. And grain crop growers, they thought that this was a good reward. They actually talked about having more confidence in the approval process, that they said it's not going to drift, and I'm sure it's not going to drift for these new formulations of the herbicide. The mixed crop and specialty crop farmers didn't think the rewards were quite as rewarding. This was a 5-point scale, so they could say, yeah, it's going to be great, or I'm not so sure about this. And one of the things that came up was the concern of kicking the can down the road. So the fact that, okay, so we're going to take care of these weeds that are resistant to glyphosate, so then what's going to happen? Are we going to have a super weed? That's one of the focus group members said, is there some super weed out there we're going to have that nothing's going to kill? So there was that concern with, especially the mixed and specialty crop growers, of what was going to come.
Okay. So do you ask at all about the risk associated not just with resistance, like within your own field, but also environmental risks that maybe aren't associated directly with your farm, but with like the world?
I didn't, just because I had so much to cover.
Yeah.
I was looking specifically at crop damage.
Okay.
So is this going to damage your neighbor's crop, or are you the neighbor that's going to have damage to yours?
Okay.
So I wasn't interested in environmental. As they call them, the weed shifts more came out of the focus groups. As you ask the question, they kind of go off and start talking about things.
And then it sounded like from before, when you're talking about the other type of studies that have been done, it also kind of avoids the actual like other environmental concerns. There didn't seem like there was much research looking at that at all.
Well, and some of that, because of this, I'm specifically looking at the motivation of the farmer.
Right.
And that could be something to study, to see if environmental concerns motivate them. But it wasn't included just because I didn't count it as a variable I wanted to look at for the motivation.
That would have opened an interesting can.
It would be interesting to see if they are motivated by that. Some of the water quality and conservation adoption gets into long-term benefits versus just short-term, where mine was very short-term. I'm just looking at damage within.
If we added that, those focus groups would go on all night.
Yes, we had to cut them off. They're farmers, they like to talk. So perception of risk. So a lot of the things that I was looking at here was asking about cognitive. Did they think that there was going to be drift that was happening? How severe did you think that drift was? Ask some questions about, had them rate what crops they thought would have the most damage versus crops that wouldn't have any or have lower damage. Also asking them about the fact that were they concerned that their neighbors might be spraying? And what it came out with was that the highest perception of risk of this product being used out in the field was with mixed crop farmers. So one of the interesting questions that I asked was, if you've had past experience with drift, and by far it was the mixed crop farmers that had the most incidences of crop damage of drift. But when you think about it, most of them are located, because they're doing both crops, they're also located where there's a lot of grain crops being grown, because they also are growing grain crops. And they also, I asked the question, well, if you've had drift, did you try to get some payment back for it? Or did you just ignore it? And mixed crop growers were most likely to ignore it. So they had the highest perception of risk, but when you start thinking that they want to get along with their neighbors, they weren't reporting drift, they were just absorbing the crop damage, their risk that they knew damage was going to happen because it happened to them in the past, and they had a higher perception of risk. The specialty crops, their perception of risk was lower than mixed crop, but higher than grain crop. And in the focus groups, they talked a lot about the risk, the fact that for them, especially if they were fruit growers, it would be multiple years. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with fruit production, but if you're doing woody vegetation, which is grapes, raspberries, blueberries, so the cane or the branch that is fruiting this year actually grew the year before. So any canes, or like if I'm growing raspberries, I'll have a cane that'll grow this summer, but that cane doesn't fruit until next summer. So if I was to get spray damage, yes, it'll lessen the yield of the ones that are fruiting this summer, but it stunted the growth of next year's yields. And so we're talking about multiple year, where for the grain crop growers, if they soybeans and corn, it's just this year. So if I damage somebody's whole field of soybeans, next year they can go plant soybeans and they'll grow just fine. There's going to be no multiple year type. And so for them, the severity of the crop loss was a risk that they were rating. And then the lowest was with grain crop farmers. And a lot of the focus groups, they talked a lot about the fact that they had experienced glyphosate risk or drift. Yeah, in fact, one of them was, yeah, I drifted on a few rows of my neighbor's corn, but you know, I knew next year he'd drift on a few of mine, so we're even. Kind of this gentleman's agreement, you know, I'm not going to squeal about you getting a bit of mine because I know I'm going to get a bit of yours, type of thing. And so they really viewed the fact that they could easily compensate somebody else, so their risk of damaging somebody else's crop wasn't such a big deal. Well, we'll be fine in the end. And they really did have confidence that the new formulations that were going to be labeled were going to do what the salesman said they would do. They were not going to drift. So between the different growers was statistically different in my perception of risk. It was not my self-efficacy, which I found interesting. So this is one area I think I'd like to explore more. Especially crop farmers actually had the highest self-efficacy. But when you start thinking about it, self-efficacy is, do I believe I can do something? It isn't whether I think it's going to work or not. It's the fact that I can do something. And so especially crop growers, they felt somewhat comfortable talking with their neighbors about drift. One of them said, yeah, I can go over and talk to him. Doesn't mean he's going to do anything, but I can go talk to him. And then they really, we'll get into the sensitive crop registry, but there is a registry out there, and they were more likely to sign up for that as things that they could do to help protect their crop. The grain crop farmers also had some, actually, yeah, this is grain crop here. And it gets back to the fact that they think they can do a good job with glyphosate. Nobody's complaining to them. There's no drift complaints that they've gotten. It's kind of like the 18-year-old who's driving too fast. They haven't been pulled over by police. So, hey, I'm doing a good job. I'm going to keep doing a good job, and it's not going to be a problem. And then the mixed crop farmers, they had the lowest self-efficacy, which is interesting. They had the highest risk. And they're the ones that do both crops. And they realized that having those crops so close together on the same farm or something, I think they had more of a realistic viewpoint of what the possibilities were. And then there was statistical differences with response efficacy. And grain crop farmers, they were the most confident. So this is really, do you think what you're doing is going to be effective? Is the type of questions that were asked. So do you think if you go out and spray and do it the way you do that you're not going to drift, you're not going to have any problems? Then yes. They didn't see their outcomes being negative when they're going to go out to spray. In fact, to them, the biggest trouble wasn't especially crop growers, it was those darn people that just have a yard right next to my field. That's who they felt was going to give them the most problems. Mixed, especially crop growers, again, it gets into this fact of the guy saying, well, yeah, I can go talk to my neighbor, but he's still going to spray. They didn't have confidence that their actions were actually going to protect their crops. Yes, I can put it on the registry that my crop, I have vulnerable crops, but nobody's going to check the registry before the spray. And so they have a low expectation of protection and so a low response efficacy. And then the final thing was asking them, well, how's this going to affect you as far as cost? So cost is your time, it's your effort. So the damage happens, how much time and effort is it going to take you to respond to an adverse thing? And so response costs, of course, for especially crop growers was very high because they understand replacement costs. One of the blueberry people talked about the fact that it takes 7 years for the blueberry bush to get to full production. So if he has a 7-year-old blueberry bush that gets totally killed, he can plant a new blueberry bush, but his yields won't be back for 7 years. And so they see that as cost is very high. And then for them, yes, I know somebody sprayed, but who did it? Was it the person right next to me? Was it the person half a mile down the road? Was it a temperature inversion, which sometimes can go a mile? They really didn't feel like they could expend a lot because it would be so costly to figure out who actually did the spraying. And then the mixed crop farmers, of course, a lot of them had past experiences of being sprayed on, and they never got paid for it. One of our focus group guys actually talked about, he had a neighbor that sprayed a whole field of collard greens, and he replaced it twice. The guy did it twice, and he still didn't go talk to him about it because he wanted to stay in good stead with his neighbor. So he absorbed the cost of replanting, having it sprayed, and then replanting, and never told anybody. And so you could see where the grain farmers, no problem. I keep good records, so they'll see that I did everything correctly. I'll show them that I followed the label correctly, did everything right, and if there's any problems, my insurance company will take them to court and we'll be fine. So you can see that we kind of have this social mismatch of what people are thinking about drift and crop damage, and so that gets into their motivation of where they think they are with the threat appraisal and with the coping appraisal. I'll make sure I move right along. So I went ahead and calculated the threat and coping appraisal. My threat appraisal is just an estimate because my reward portion, my alpha was too low, so it's not reliable. So but I went ahead and did it anyway just to kind of get an estimate. And so threat level, you can see where the mixed crop, they had a low, or they had the highest threat appraisal. So it's the fact that they had the most perception of risk, the rewards were low for them, and then it also goes over to the coping, because both especially and mixed crops are together, and then they had the lowest coping scores. Statistically, there was no difference between the specialty and mixed crop growers. So they're pretty much the same in what they were thinking. The difference was between the grain crop in regard to the specialty and mixed. The grain crop don't think there's a threat, and they, very confident that they can handle it. So where does this leave us? And basically what I wanted to do with this study was to tease out a lot of this stuff, because anecdotally, those of us that worked in pesticide training have heard the stories. We've heard the stories of somebody getting drift, getting damaged, not doing anything about it, or frustration over not being able to tell their neighbor to stop spraying. And so it gets into what are some things that we can do as ag communicators. Since I do work for Extension, as Extension professionals, what are some things that we could do to change this balance that we've got going? Because eventually, as happened in Arkansas, even though there's been no fights yet, you know, these things can grow, multiply, and we can get conflict. And so it's realizing that the grain farmers really don't have motivation to change right now. And it's kind of like the smoker. We can tell them all day long that their drip is going to affect their next door neighbor, and they're like, yeah, whatever. And so they kind of tune us out. And then we think about the mixed and specialty crop that, yeah, they think they can go do something, but why? He's still going to spray and kill my crops. And so we kind of have this imbalance that's keeping both sets of farmers not motivated to do anything. So one of the things I asked about was the Ohio Sensitive Crop Registry. So what this is, it exists in other states as Drift Watch. Ohio has their own system. So if I'm a specialty crop grower, it's an account where you set up an account, and I can put on a map where my crops are. And I can identify, do I have greenhouses here? Do I have bees here? Do I have, you know, some tomatoes or grapes? And then the system is also set up so if you are a pesticide applicator or any farmer, and you're going to be spraying some crops that might, you know, hurt some vulnerable crops, you can go on and see where those crops are. Kind of a communication without them having to go up and knock on the door and do a face-to-face. The surprising thing was not a lot of people are using it. So of the survey, and actually in the focus groups, I had one person in one group that talked about Drift Watch, which is the one in Indiana. It's not the one here in Ohio. So essentially nobody mentioned that Ohio had a system. And so what I found is that 40% had never even heard about it. And 45%, yeah, I've heard about it, but it's this motivation thing. They didn't feel motivated to actually go to the website and look at it because why bother? And so this is the percentages down here of the grain mix. And as you can see, much higher in the grain crop farmers that they had never heard of it or never gone and checked it out. And the sad thing, this is how many grain farmers in my survey had registered for it. So understandably, they don't have crops to put on there, but it's also there for them to go see if anybody is making some or has some vulnerable crops nearby. And so a lot of this is that we do have some tools available like this. We're just not getting that message out to farmers. So my recommendations for communicators is we really need some strategies on how to reach these farmers. A lot of times when we develop communication strategies for farmers, we think of them as a homogenous group. They're just all farmers, and we're going to get this message out to them. And what I found is there's some real differences in what motivates them, what their risks are that they have. And so we need to make messages that are going to appeal to the different groups of farmers. Having the Ohio Sensitive Crop Registry in Ohio, we're very fortunate because ours is the only one that's password protected. All the others are public. And the difference of that is some farmers are very scared about putting things out, because of vandalism or things like this. And it's a protected system, which is an advantage over those that are just public domain. And so it's getting the word out that it's there and that, to help motivate them on why they should participate and how it's going to help. And when we're talking to grain farmers, we have to keep in mind, they think they're doing a pretty darn good job because no one's told them different. They've not had any experiences, and actually they do a good job with glyphosate. And so if we go out and tell them, hey, you're doing a horrible job, I tried that with my kids, it doesn't work. And so I think you need to make sure that our messages recognize the fact that they are doing a lot of good stuff. As a pesticide applicator trainer, the fact that they all talked about record keeping was just like, yay, because that's all we told them to do, and they told it back to us. It's like, wow, they listened. So they are doing a lot of good things right, and so it's making sure that we recognize what they've done well and just help them understand how to do better, because this is just, it's a different thing. Since 1996, a lot of farmers have only used glyphosate. So we're actually working with a generation of farmers who've not used these other chemistries. So they truly have not worked with them. They don't understand how they are different, how they're going to react. And then I think also it's helping the different groups of farmers understand that not every type of crop goes back to equal 1 acre of corn. USDA does all of their pricing based on an acre of corn. So you kind of have that mindset, and it's just helping them understand that there are some differences in the crops. Things like this. This is actually standing in my front yard. I do have a little bit of a bias because I am a specialty crop grower. I grow strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries. And this is my neighbor across the road's soybeans. And so first thing in the morning, what came out is a lot of the grain crop growers have been taught about glyphosate. You do not spray when there's wind blowing. Well, there's no wind blowing first thing in the morning. But first thing in the morning, this I took, it was about 7 o'clock in the morning, looking out at the soybean field across the road. And as you can see, if you were to spray right then, there's an inversion. And that's a little valley. That's a little town on the other side of the valley. It would all just sit there and cause drift on mine. So it's helping them change that mindset. They've been doing it this way. You know, yes, it works with glyphosate, but you're going to have to change it up. And so it's messages to motivate behavioral change is what we're looking at. And helping them understand some of the maladaptive that we get when people have low threat and high coping. They don't realize that they're hurting someone else. Because if no one's told them, they don't realize. And so it's helping them understand that they are hurting somebody else. And for ag communicators, helping extension and industry with some visuals and some ideas to help them understand. And I'll go to my next slide. I'll get on my soapbox. I'll do extension first. Okay. But for extension educators, the mixed crop farmers are something that I don't think extension has recognized. So sometimes if you're doing a grain presentation and you kind of belittle the specialty crop growers and reduce the risk about them, not realizing you have specialty crop growers sitting in there because they're there for the grain as well as the specialty crop. And sometimes that can really turn them off because they think if the extension educator or the ag teacher is up there belittling this, then they don't need to worry about it. So some of that personality things that we put into. And the same thing, if you're in a specialty crop meeting, you can't demonize the grain crop growers because you've got some there in the room for us. So some of that is realizing that these mixed farmers exist, and we need to make sure that our messages resonate with them as well as the group that we're talking to. I've talked about the cost differential. Something grain farmers might not realize, USDA has robust crop insurance for grain, does not for specialty crops. It's lagging very, very far behind. A lot of grain crop growers are, well, insurance will just take care of it. Specialty crops do not get the subsidies that the grain crop, and it's just the fact they don't know. And it's helping them realize that there is a gap there. And also the time of year of when you're spraying. Because if I spray, like my strawberries, we're flowering in May. So if they're spraying 2,4-D in May, yeah, it's fine for the soybeans, but it's not fine for strawberries. I'm at the height of when they're most vulnerable that you can do the most damage. And for the end, this is my soapbox, for the industry. Because the co-ops and the seed companies only work with grain farmers, they just don't know about specialty crops. They just don't know their value. They don't know when they're most vulnerable. They don't know what their growing cycles are. They just don't know. And so I think some communication to help those technical reps, because we saw that they actually were ahead of extension for information for grain farmers. So if the grain farmers aren't coming to the extension meetings and getting that other side, we need to take that message to the technical folks at the co-ops and seed companies working with the grain farmers, that they can help get this message to help understand. And a lot of it isn't because they purposely don't tell them, they just don't know the difference with specialty crops, and it's doing that communication so they can tell their clients. And with any sales presentation, you need to include the downsides. In the focus groups, there was a lot of farmers extremely confident that the new formulations they had for 2,4-D and dicamba that were going to be used this summer were airtight. No need to worry about drift. And then we've had at least 4 states have to tell people not to spray dicamba at certain times because there's been so many complaints. So it's helping the industry realize that they need to tell them the downsides, so that they, because if they don't think there's a risk, they're going to behave differently. To help them to understand those risks, and what you thought you could do to cope maybe isn't going to work as well. Okay. And then just, of course, there's lots of future research. I think this is a cool topic. I would like to get into it more. I think the whole cooperation and motivation with farmers is something we're just scratching the surface on, and why they adopt certain practices and why they don't. And then something I really think you can get into is when we talk about how the consumer accepts agricultural practices. You know, this is a theory that's used a lot in science communication. And in science communication, we're really talking about people's fears of science. And then we're also talking about how they think they can cope with those fears. So, for example, nuclear power, we can show them all day long how safe nuclear power is. People don't die from nuclear power. How many years has it been since there's been an accident in the US in a nuclear power plant? But because they have that fear that's not based on science, they fear those plants and think they can't cope with it. So I think in agriculture, that's one of the things that we're facing, is that they have the fear and they don't know how they can cope with that. So as we talk about modern farming practices, I think we forget how afraid people can be of science. And so I'm hoping this will be used in lots of areas. So, any questions? Yes.
So you talked about one of your limitations for distributing your survey is it being, you have to do it as a paper-based rather than online because you had such a high population of Amish farmers. I was wondering if you explored then, since there were so few people who had used the registration database, how that might have played into that, because if you have a large population of Amish farmers, they wouldn't necessarily be using an online database.
And I think that'd be something that would be good to research. It's available to them. A lot of the Amish farmers are set up with co-ops where they have produce auctions, and they offer the sensitive registry to them there to set things up. But I think it is the whole, everything around the sensitive crop registry, I think really could be its own standalone. I asked one question, got all this information, and like, man, there's a lot of stuff there. I think exactly things like that. How comfortable do they feel using computers? Even because, you know, the age, they're older, the folks that are doing it. Definitely.
We have to get up. We have a guest speaker for the faculty.
Okay.
That starts now. So
Okay.
That was so great.
you did phenomenal. I'm so sorry to have to cut that off.
Oh, no.
This is the second of 3 meetings this afternoon.
And if anybody, you know, because I'm not in the grad office, My office is on the basement.
Yeah.
I'm right on the doorway there, so stop by anytime.
Wonderful
Great,
job.
thank you so